Hello, Garland Nixon here. We're hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. He is an expert in covert action. Let's talk. Hello, Garland Nixon here. We're hanging out with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. And he's got a great website, one of my favorite, covertactionmagazine.com. And we're going to talk about some articles there today. Let me start off with this, get your thoughts. We've got this alleged conflict going on here. We've got the U.S. saying to Iran, you've got to stop doing everything we tell you to stop doing, regardless of international law. And Iran saying, we ain't going to do it. And it is a interesting time because the U.S. can attack Iran. Apparently, there are lots of articles where people from the Pentagon are saying, probably ain't a good idea. Now, these are the people that are supposed to do it, saying, hey, we could lose a lot of people, and they're going to close the Straits of Hormuz. So I'm watching this video, and there's a senator, Kennedy. I don't even know where the hell he's from. And he's saying, yeah, it's the mullahs, the Ayatollah wants to will kill us and drink our blood from a boot. And I'm thinking, oh, we're screwed. We got some idiot who's just, the Ayatollahs want to kill us and drink our blood from a boot. And then they show some lunatic former leader in Naftali Bennett or whoever the hell. And he's saying, yes, he's giving us the Dick Cheney business. Yes. They want to get a nuclear weapon, and they want to have missiles that can reach our shores, and then we'll be dealing with this in New York. Remember Condi Rice? Well, we don't want the evidence to be a mushroom cloud. And I'm like, the level of discourse in our so-called leadership is so pathetic and false. You ask yourself where it's so obvious that the empire is in terminal decline. Your thoughts on that whole thing, Dr. Kuzmarov, Jeremy?
Well, one thing about the low level of public discourse, I teach American history, and if you look at like 100 years ago, when the U.S. was a rising empire, there was an anti-imperialist league, and there was actually a robust debate in Congress, and there were some very eloquent, congressmen and senators who spoke out, gave very eloquent speeches and arguments against U.S. imperial behavior, figure like Robert La Follette. And if you go back, their speeches were pretty impressive and well reasoned, well argued. And these were knowledgeable people. So at least there was a debate, and there were a lot of senators who were against like the war in the Philippines, and they spoke this 130 years ago or something. But we don't have that kind of debate now. Yeah, you have these just ignorant views, and where is the left opposition? What kind of critique are they mounting? And periodically there are some dissent against particular interventions, but there isn't a broader anti-imperialist movement or anti-imperialist critique from anybody in Congress. And I think, you also have to look at the state of education, because I've worked in education, and it's dismal. Whether the colleges or high school, they don't teach, young people the real history. They don't teach world events in a fair-minded way. They don't cultivate understanding for the perspective of other countries. And that's really important. If more Americans understood the perspective of Iranian, the history of colonization in the Middle East, and the role of the CIA on the coup in 1953 and installing the Shah, and how the Islamic Revolution came about to reclaim Iranian sovereignty, I think a lot of Americans would have more sympathy for the Iranian government and not want to go to war with it. So I really think the education system is failing dismally. And I tried to work in that area, but it's very difficult for teachers or professors who try and teach more critical history among students or raise their consciousness. They face a lot of hurdles and attacks and potential job loss and new McCarthyism. So I think that's something we have to fight back against.
When I taught organized crime, amongst other things, and the students were astounded because I made sure I taught in depth. I taught about piracy. I started with organized crime. I started with pirates, and it was like a form of organized crime. But then I would teach all about it, and then I would teach, but they worked for the British. That the British literally had pirate boats that would go out and steal stuff, and then they would go sell it. And they would use that to disrupt trade. I thought about the Opium Wars, where the U.S. was, the British was literally, forcing drugs, and they went to war to force other countries to allow them to sell drugs, that they were drug dealers. Also about the prohibition, how basically the level of corruption in the government, that in prohibition, one of the jobs you wanted to be a treasury guy that monitored illegal whiskey, because these treasury guys were like making an average salary, and they had like 3 and 4 houses and vacation homes in Miami and stuff like that. That it was all, and what I got into is the endemic corruption of organized crime, that organized crime was a facet of international crime and corruption, but that it was inextricably linked to politics and government and corporation. Of course, I got into, if you've ever seen the videos called Cocaine Cowboys, about all of the cocaine coming into in the 80s into Miami, and of course how the government was involved and all the other things going on there.
Yeah, I think that's great what you were doing, and unfortunately, and that really opens students' minds to the corruption, and punctures the narrative of American exceptionalism, that our country is so much greater than other countries. When you see that the level of corruption that exists here, because I think that fuel these racist stereotypes of other countries. When people have this idealized view of the United States, and then they're fed only negative stories about Russia or Iran or Cuba. So they think America is such a greater nation than these countries. But when you really get into the heart of it, there's mammoth corruption here. So I think that's incredibly important. And that would, lead students to just think more critically. And that's what I try and do. And students are receptive. I think that's why teachers like us are considered dangerous, because we actually reach these students, and we're popular, among the students. And that's kind of, young people are open-minded. They're in a rebellious age, so they're kind of eager to hear more honest and critical history. So that's why they target people like us in the media and education system.
Every student I ever had in that organized crime class, everyone said, "This is my favorite class I've ever had." They really enjoyed organized crime. We talked about Tammany Hall. That was a big part of it, the Tammany Hall and the connections between, of course, the politics, because it was very clear and obvious. And then I got into the various, political organizations, the Pendergast, what was the one in Kansas City?
Oh yeah, and that's how Truman owed his career to the Pendergast machine. They make like Truman was this wholesome Midwesterner, but really he was a tool of the Pendergast machine. And he once he became the president, and his attorney general was Tom Clark, Ramsey Clark's father.
I
And
didn't know that.
basically he made sure that the Pendergasts weren't prosecuted for all these criminal thing they had done. So yeah, I teach that kind of history as well. I've taught criminology because I did my thesis on the war on drugs, and that was my learning experience into the corruption and how the CIA was complicit in the drug trade. So we covered that in my course. So yeah, I think we cover some of the same turf, and yeah, students, that's the kind of history they want to learn. So
Let
and
me
it opens their mind. Yeah.
let
They
me
think more critically. and that's why they try and suppress that kind of teaching.
If I can find it.
Yeah, there's a good book by Jonathan Marshall I would recommend. It's called Dark Quadrant: How Organized Crime took over American politics, and he has a whole chapter on Truman and Pendergast and Tom Clark, and then he goes into other presidents like Nixon and LBJ and their ties with organized crime. It's a very good book. He's a very good researcher.
Here's an example. U.S. government helped the rise of Mexican drug cartel. Mexican newspapers revealed secret arrangement between DEA and Sinaloa cartel. The U.S. government allowed the Mexican Sinaloa cartel to carry out its business unimpeded between 2000 and 2012 in exchange for information, right? Now, how do we know this? Citing court documents. The Mexican newspaper reports DA officers met with top Sinaloa officials over 50 times, offered to have charges against cartel members dropped in the U.S., among other pledges, right? They said the tactic has previously been used in Colombia, Cambodia, Thailand, and Afghanistan, right? Of course, the modus operandi involves a violation of public international law, right? And so Miles Frechette, a former U.S. ambassador to Colombia, said, while the problem of drug trafficking in Colombia persists, the tactic of secret agreements had managed to reduce it. So that's a U.S. ambassador says, well, when we made deals with the cartels to ensure that they could bring drugs into the United States, that decreased the drugs that coming into the United States. Here's why I said that. We're getting this propaganda now about, oh, there's terrible things going on in Mexico with these drug cartels. And my position is, we arm the drug cartels. We train the people who are the fighters in the drug cartels. We make secret deals with the drug cartels so they can transport drugs into the United States. I have little doubt that the United States was behind this and that this was a false flag in Mexico, Jeremy.
Well, yeah, I would recommend listeners. Peter Dale Scott is a brilliant guy. He's now in his 90s, but for years he's a professor at University of California at Berkeley, and he wrote a lot of the books. I think he coined the term the deep state, and he did a lot of studies on the war on drugs and corruption in U.S. government and law enforcement, and he considers the war on drugs, I think accurately, as a phony war. That the United States will only selectively go after certain drug gangs because they want to alter market share and they want to protect their own allies and assets in countries like Mexico and Colombia. And often the big-time drug traffickers are allied with governments that go after left-wing groups whom the U.S. government seeks to suppress. So they need the drug gangs and their paramilitary. And drugs is revenue. So whoever controlled the drug trade has the power because they have the money. Who has the money has the power, and the money is in oil and drugs. So control over that is crucial. So the CIA and U.S. government want their people controlling it. So the war on drugs is a phony war. They celebrate they got this kingpin, but really it's just to alter the landscape. And I mean, if you really wanted to combat the drug trade, you'd have to fight the demand. You'd have to address the root causes. And that gets into the high inequality level, the despond. I mean, if you look at the U.S. economy, a lot of people have been shut out. In an era of deindustrialization and this kind of new gilded age we're living in, there's declining opportunity for a lot of youth, and especially in certain regions of the country or rural areas. They're turning more to drugs. So if you really wanted to fight the drug trade, you'd have to address the inequality of the economy. You'd have to focus on a more robust treatment program to help people who have addiction issues, to wean them off drugs. But the government doesn't want to invest in that. That's one way to actually start to curtail the problem. But they're not doing that. And they're fighting this phony war on drugs that's really about trying to control the drug trade for them and their allies. So that's, I think, one of Scott's insight from a number of books that he wrote on that topic. So, yeah, you can relate that to what's going on now in Mexico. It's not a real war on drugs. And, yeah, it's creating vicious escalation. The history shows that a militarized approach And in Mexico, that started with the Bush and Obama administration instituted the ill-conceived Plan Merida, which was built on the Plan Colombia, which was a total failure in Colombia. That was a billion-dollar drug war operation that focused on militarized enforcement instead of social programs. And in Colombia, it was found to have the drug supply rates out of Colombia increased despite the billions that were spent, and it led to more. It beefed up the Colombian army and the paramilitaries, who often came from the drug cartels, and they were implicated in massive human rights abuses against the left-wing guerrilla groups in Colombia. And there was even a false positive scandal where they were murdering people and counting them as guerrillas, and they had killed like thousands of civilians, and that was with U.S. weaponry, and that was though repeated in Mexico, even though it was a horror show in Colombia. Bush and Obama just repeated the same policy in Mexico, and then it led to a cataclysm in the mid 2000s when you had Felipe Calderon. It led to just an orgy of violence. And did nothing to actually curtail the supply rates, which were being controlled by the Sinaloa cartel, which the U.S. government favored. So they were going after rivals to the Sinaloa. It was provoking vicious cycles of violence, doing nothing to address the underlying problems. And, in the case of Mexico, the NAFTA was found by specialists to have contributed to a huge boost in the supply from Mexico to the United States, because it open up the border more, loosen trade regulations, loosen regulations on banks that launder the money, and also ravage the Mexican agricultural sector, because it basically favored U.S. agribusiness. And so you had all these farmers who were thrown out of business, and a lot of youth migrated to the city, and they had no work and limited education, so they gravitated to the drug trade as the only way to make a living. And then also farmers started growing more drug crops because they couldn't compete with big U.S. agribusiness in the regular crops. So if we want to combat the drug trade, we have to address NAFTA and how it screwed over Mexicans and harmed their rural economy, and also loosen the regulation on the banking system. So yeah, it doesn't make any sense what they're doing, but it benefits the usual people. So the military-industrial complex gets new excuse for fancy, producing all these weapons they can give and military gear to the Mexican to fight drugs. And yeah, I agree with you. Their country is destabilized more and more, and then the U.S. could use that as a pretext to ratchet up more military intervention and assert more control over Mexico, because don't forget, the U.S. controlled a lot of the Mexican economy, after the Mexican-American War, until the Mexican Revolution was designed for Mexico to reassert control over its natural resources and oil. And, there's still remnants of the revolutionary regime in Mexico, but the U.S. wants to have more control, dominate the oil, the control their resources, so they can use the instability fueled by the drug war as an excuse to go in more in Mexico and reverse the gains of the Mexican Revolution. And that's the goal of U.S. foreign policy in that country and every other country.
And the last two presidents have done things like nationalize the electricity and nationalize and the U.S. has been anger. I don't think it's an accident that, like, the week before Donald Trump does like days before Donald Trump is going to do his speech, all of a sudden we've got this thing going on in Mexico. It's completely covered by it's almost like they already had the cameras there waiting, everything's set up, and they show these pictures, and it's like, it looks like, and the thing about it is, they show these pictures and they give the appearance that Mexico as a country is just going up in smoke everywhere and the whole country is a disaster. And when you talk to people that were there, it was like, no, there was a couple places here that this happened. Like there was a couple incidents in the context of an entire country that weren't really much. There were a couple incidents here and there, right? But when you see the news, it looks like the entire country is up in flames and it's going. You know how they do. It's like when the Saddam statue toppled, and they had this camera that looked like there was thousands of people. And when you saw it backed off, it was like 30 people that they had literally bust in to make it look, but they had to get the camera up close to look like it was giant crowds. They make it appear as though the country is going up in smoke for the purposes of their, political and rhetoric. But in reality, if there was a country, it's a humongous country, the most populated Catholic country, I think, on earth. And it really wasn't what they made it appear to be. And it seems to me that I just think it was completely political. And anytime I hear, well, I know through, what was that called? It was called the Operation Fast and Furious, whatever it was, under Holder, where they shipped all of these. So we shipped all of these guns in. I also found out, and I taught this when I was teaching, I had a whole bunch of information on this when I was teaching organized crime. The U.S. would bring these people from these police departments over, right? And we would teach them how to be paramilitary and teach them with, like, of course, all Clay says you're going to be shocked to find out where. Fort Bragg. So we'd bring them into Fort Bragg and we teach them how to be military guys and arm them with the latest military weapons and all of this kind of stuff. Now, they were making $300 a month as a policeman. We'd send them over there. Immediately, the drug dealers would hire them for $3,000 a month. So we would arm and train them, say, okay, now you're in town such and so, and you're going to be a member of the police force to fight the drugs. And they get back. And immediately they were, and I thought to myself, I think we knew when they went back who they were going to work for. If I can figure it out and teach it to a class, and the historical evidence is everywhere, you're not going to tell me the U.S. government didn't know it. We were basically training drug cartel members and arming them ourselves.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, yeah. And that's another factor in the bankruptcy of the war on drugs. And yeah, they're supplying a lot of the weapons to the cartels directly in Operation like Fast and the Furious. And yeah, we have an article this coming week in the Covert Action on the Mexican drug war. And the author and I was helping her out with some of the research. And we found that something like, I forget the numbers, but it's upward of 50% of weapons are coming from an army plant in Kansas City that are going to the drug cartels in Mexico. All the weapons are being produced here in the United States. And then that Mexicans, cartel operatives are going to Ukraine and getting training there in use of drones. And so that's also subsidized by the United States, who's funding the Ukrainian military, and the special forces are there training the military and these Mexican drug cartels. So, and it gets to my point. It's a phony war on drugs, and perhaps the U.S. government wants it to go on and escalate because it gives excuse for more intervention. It feeds the military-industrial complex, and it would give an excuse for the U.S. to go in and assert more control over Mexico. So, and they don't want a strong Mexico. That could challenge the United States over time. And don't forget the U.S. Stole a lot of Mexican land in the Mexican-American War. So, and since that time, they want to keep Mexico weak so that they can control its economy and keep it in check. And the war on drugs is a good way to do that.
So let's get going. Covertactionmagazine.com is where you want to go. Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov is the editor, and he is the senior writer there. And there's a lot of great articles today. Here's one. And I remember this guy, Sam Brownback. And what I remember is he was basically an ideologue. He was one of those ideologues that just screamed, tax cuts, tax cuts, tax cuts, smaller government. No context, no discussion about what the government's supposed to be or not supposed to be, whether the tax cuts are good, bad. Should be an intellectual conversation. That's a valid intellectual conversation. There are a lot of people that say, why should we be paying taxes when they're just going to use the money for war? There's all kinds of discussions that should be had about taxes, right? But Sam Brownback never had an intellectual conversation in his life that I saw. So this lunatic, who basically destroyed Kansas when he left, I remember when they called it the Kansas experiment. I don't remember, wasn't that guy Laffer, what's his name, involved? You know what I'm talking about?
Yeah, you're right. They brought these extreme right-wing ideologues who have this vision of government to cut taxes to the bone, cut public services, privatize everything, rely on the free market, and rely on private philanthropy to help the poor. but it doesn't work in practice. At this show, that the experiment proved to be a disaster, and especially at the state level, because it's not that the taxpayer money is going to wars at the state level. It's going to things like paying the teachers and keeping the schools open and funding healthcare and keeping the roads improvements. So when you cut the state income tax down to almost nothing, you have to cut these public services, and that's what occurred in Kansas. It was moving toward more third world level. They had to move to like 4-day school week. They cut teachers, and it had disastrous effects in the state. And people describe it as like carnage and destruction. And they're cutting like the uh, mental health programs. So you had and then the police have to deal. Most of the mentally ill people end up being put in jail, and so the jails become overcrowded. Because I live in Oklahoma, and it was a similar. It was basically modeled after the Kansas experiment, uh, and it's been a disaster for Oklahoma as well. Like their prisons are grossly overcrowded and understaffed, and actually the inmates are running the prisons, and they're extorting other inmates and forcing them, threatening their lives and forcing their families to pay extortion money. And there aren't enough guards to control this. And they're also overrun with drugs and methamphetamines because, again, there's not adequate staffing. So you're getting those kind of problems in this experiment. And you have the school week moving to four days a week, and they're already they're ranked like among the worst states as far as education, and it's just plummeting further. And a lot of the teachers had to leave these states because the pay is so abysmal. They can find a reasonable pay in neighboring states, so they go there. They can't make a living teaching because they cut the salaries so much. And they cut the staff in school, and students don't have adequate supplies. And I've covered some of these issues as a local reporter because I've done freelance reporting, and I covered a teacher strike in Oklahoma, and the teachers were showing me their classroom from around the state. Like they had mold in their classroom, it was unsanitary conditions. And I was talking to high school teachers, and they said there weren't enough chairs, and they were trying to keep, these are in rural areas. They're trying to keep the students in school to graduate and maybe go to college. But when there's not enough chairs and not enough books, they don't want to come to school. It's not a good environment for learning, and very difficult to keep them in school. And then they're also talking about the debt they face. These are people with advanced degrees, masters, but they have heavy debt, and their salary is so low they can never pay their debt. It's totally unfair. They're doing a great service for society, and also a lot of them were overworked. They had to do. I talked to a number of people there. They had to work at restaurants at night. These were hardworking teachers by day. Then they had to work at a restaurant at night and on the weekend. They had no free time. They're exhausted, and they're still in debt, and it's just totally unfair. So this model of government just doesn't work the state level. And there was a pushback. Brownback was one of the most unpopular governors in the history of the state. His popularity rating was abysmal. So why did the NED hire him? They hired the worst people, the NED, and they got their funding restored. They made a big stink because Trump cut the funding. This is the National Endowment for Democracy, an offshoot of the CIA that promotes propaganda and regime change abroad. So they're going to have Brownback, promoting his vision of government in countries around the world, and that's not what they need in those countries. And they appoint the worst kind of people. They claim to be for freedom and democracy, and they got their budget restored. That was one of the sensible things Trump did was, and there was some critical comments about the NED from people like Elon Musk, and that they had their funding cut, but then they sued and they got it restored, and now they're back as ever. And I've seen their director Damon Wilson spoke before Congress this week, and he was bragging about all the activity they have in Cuba and Venezuela. They're clearly trying to undermine those governments, support regime change operations. And they also appointed this horrible China hawk John Molinar, a congressman from Michigan, to their board, who's been chairing these, McCarthy-style hearings that's basically warning of Chinese infiltration of American education and claiming that Chinese are gobbling American land. And he's reinvoking like a xenophobic rhetoric from the 19th century, and he's blaming China. They had hearings by this guy Molinar how China is behind the fentanyl crisis, and China responded and said, "No, we're not." In fact, China has some of the harshest drug laws in the world, and a lot of the fentanyl comes from Mexico, from these cartels that are
It
armed
does.
by the United States and trained in Ukraine. And fentanyl is also easy to produce and is produced domestically. So to blame China, and fentanyl is the result of a lot of the social breakdown in American communities and the inequality and lack of opportunities for young people. So to blame China, it's very dangerous. It's like what they do with immigrants. It projects social problems onto foreign countries or minority groups, and then it breeds hatred and momentum for war. In the case of China, it's building momentum to support a war against China or a proxy war. So these kind of people are horrible, and yet that's what the NED is putting on their board, and it reflects the agenda of that agency, is to stir up hatred against the Chinese, not present an objective analysis of China. And sure, there are problems within China, but there are also a lot of good things going on in China. So if you want to be objective, but these are just demagogue and hate mongers, and we need to reject these kind of people. But NED is putting them in and fueling more hatred.
Well, here's an example. Let me show you why I think Brownback would be perfect. Here we go. Ambassador Sam Brownback, solidarity with Israel. Now, let's see what they were talking about at this roundtable. Topics of our conversations: his recent journey to Israel with Mike Huckabee, the rise of anti-Semitism, the Iranian threat in the Middle East and beyond, threats to Western civilization, religious freedom, blah, blah, blah. There we got him with Mike Huckabee walking around in Israel. There we go. So, okay. So my point being, they show him with, of all people, Brownback with Mike Huckabee, who is an absolute lunatic, who embarrassed himself, a week ago, saying that Israel should be able to take all of the Middle East. We're all for that. And there's Senator Brownback wandering around with him. So my point being, they put him on the National Endowment for Democracy because, as you said, I mean, it's terrible that this guy would be on any board anywhere, but the fact that he did a horrible job is the reason that he's on there, because the horrible job, including pushing the narrative that they want against, whether now with one guy, it's, you said this guy Molinar they put on, it's, we want somebody on here who's going to aim at China and say China's terrible. Now you see him talking about Iran. Well, there you go. They put him on there and he's like, Israel's great, and we've got to go against Iran. They find people who, I'm sure there are people on there who are Russia haters. They just find the points around the world of people who hate any particular thing and say, you lead the regime change operation on Venezuela, you on Cuba, you on Iran, you know what I mean?
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And, Brownback is supposed to be for religious. He was appointed after he was governor as some kind of ambassador for religious freedom. And as you say, yeah, he's with Huckabee, the most dangerous extremist and Muslim, hates Muslims and thinks, yeah, Israel should, as you say, take over the entire Middle East. So where's the religious freedom there? He wants to destroy all the Muslims. So it's so hypocritical, and this NED should be viewed as a hate mongering organization, and it's a disgrace to be financed by the U.S. government, promoting hatred against different countries. And they also the third new person they appointed was involved with or in a high position in the Arthur Vandenberg Center, which I don't know if you've heard of that, but it's one of these inside the Beltway think tank named after Arthur Vandenberg, who was a senator from Michigan who had been in the 30s. He was an isolationist and he was against war, but then he shifted at the end of World War II, and he became notorious as a Cold War hawk in Congress and he was the head of the Senate Foreign Relations. And Truman came to him. This relates to Truman. He said, "What are we going to do? We want to go after the Russians, but the American public wants peace after the end of World War II. What are we going to do?" Truman actually asked Vandenberg that, and Vandenberg's response was, "We have to scare the hell out of the American public about the Russians." And I said, that's fitting that he's somebody from the Vandenberg Center is appointed to the NED board, because that's what they do. They want to scare the hell out of us about how evil Iran is, and they're such a threat. Iran, you pick the country the day of the week: China, Iran, Venezuela, Cuba, Russia, and that's what they do. They try and scare the hell out of the public, and it's not objective analysis of these countries. And if you travel, you and I have traveled to different countries. When you go there, the people are friendly. It's not a crisis mode in the country. They don't hate Americans. The country is doing reasonably well, but they want us to think, as you were saying at the beginning, that they want to drink American blood, which is not the case. They're just manipulating the public, and it's very, very dangerous people and organizations.
Yeah, and so now what we see, and what's interesting is you talk about him, and you bring up here he was an intern for Bob Dole, and he became involved with the Fellowship, a secret group that fused political conservatism with fervent Christian belief. Abram Veride was the founder. Considered Union leader Harry Bridges, who ordered the famous 1934 San Francisco dock worker strike, which is interesting because my dad was a dock worker, and at times he went on strike, to be satanic and a Soviet agent. So you always find these people who have a connection to some, what was the guy's name in the 50s that Reagan liked, 50s and 60s? I can't think of his name, but if I said, right?
Yeah, it's like these extremist organizations. Exactly. These are extremist fanatics, yeah, like the John Birch Society.
John Birch, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah, they claim that Dwight Eisenhower was a communist agent and Henry Kissinger because he made some overtures of détente. And John Birch Society was funded, I found, by Fred Trump was one of the funders, along with the Koch brothers. So it's these billionaires who fund these extremist groups who are connected to the military-industrial complex.
To talk about this, you also bring up, and now that's the thing. People don't realize that Sam Brownback was like the international ambassador for religious freedom and religious right or something like that. But you talk about his selective support for religious freedom and human rights abuses. What do we need to know about that?
Yeah, and that's what the NED does, and NED kind of shapes off in the media narrative. So, I mean, there are articles, if you pick up the New York Times or watch CNN or MSNBC, you might get, New York Times has all these articles about religious persecution in China, and that Christian pastors were arrested because they didn't register their church. And that may be true, but they don't spotlight religious persecution. They're not. It's tied to a political agenda. They want to denounce the Chinese government. I mean, the U.S. has been trying to destabilize the Chinese communist government since the 1949 Chinese Revolution, because China asserted, control over their own resources. It was an independent, nationalist government that was trying to overcome the legacy of colonialism and neocolonialism in China, and doesn't, play ball with the United States, allow military bases on their soil, for example. So they target anything bad going on in that country. But then the country the U.S. allies with, like Ukraine, there are more and more reports about serious religious persecution going on in Ukraine, that the Zelensky government, that they basically took over various Russian Orthodox churches and removed the church leadership and imposed their own style of Christianity, and that there are actually religious figures who are being jailed in Ukraine who tried to stand out against this. but this gets no reporting in U.S. media, or it's not something the NED claims to be so concerned about upholding religious freedom. But when bad things are going on in Ukraine or Syria, you have an Al Qaeda government that's attacking the Shia Alawite population and that destroyed a lot of churches. Dan Kovalik and I wrote a book about Syria regime change, and Kovalik, who's a lawyer for the Shia Alawite community, he spent a lot of time in Syria, and he's a Christian himself, and he went to churches and they told them about how they were being persecuted and attacked. And this was even before the Al Qaeda triumph over Assad. It's gotten worse since that government took root in December 2024. But we don't have any stories about that. The NED never spotlights people who are facing religious persecution, including Christians, in Syria and this Al Qaeda and its Muslim extremist government. So it's a complete double standard. I mean, I personally, I'm all for religious freedom. I'm not religious myself, but I believe everybody has the right to practice their own religion. So I'm against any religious persecution, but I would like to see consistent. If they have credibility, they would be consistent. But what's clear that they have a politicized agenda to target religious persecution only in countries that the U.S. wants to make the country look bad, so they can build public opinion against that country and support either military intervention or other forms of attack on that country, such as economic warfare or trying to isolate that country, like they're doing with China, Venezuela, and many other countries. So.
Well, and a perfect example was Hong Kong. Some of these pastors, they're saying, okay, the Chinese government cracked down on this or that pastor. Well, if they're in the White House getting hugged and they're getting National Endowment for Democracy, clearly they should be, viewed as spies, number one. But number two, in Hong Kong, which is part of China, the U.S. recently sentenced someone China recently sentenced someone to, I forgot, 9 or 17 years, whatever it was, for working with the U.S. And they were taking money, they were being financed by the U.S., and they were working to do these, which were basically regime change operation, violent coup-related, they called them protests, but really they were riots in Hong Kong. Well, the Chinese recently convicted someone, and now the U.S. is like, oh, that person is a political prisoner, etc. But they were on our payroll, and what would any other country do? So we send these people in, we finance them to do regime change operations, and then when the Chinese government finds out what they're doing, and sentence them, then we pretend like there's some kind of a political prisoner and a human rights violation.
Exactly, yeah. And I was spotlighting the case of this guy Vladimir Kara-Murza in Russia. They made like he was some kind of hero, but this political prisoner. But actually, he was a British citizen, and who was John McCain's pallbearer at his funeral, and he was working with Bill Browder, this sinister billionaire, to lobby for sanctions against Russia. And and he was supporting regime change operation, and he was in Russia, and he was tied with Free Russia Foundation, which was found to have intelligence ties, whose goal was to undermine the Russian government. So, he basically engaged in what can be considered treason. So he's not really a political prisoner as they frame him. I mean, if somebody was American was over in Russia and lobbying the Russian government to attack the United States and was tied with Russian intelligence networks that were supporting opposition politicians and interfering in U.S. politics, he would be under indictment in the United States. So, we should be consistent about that.
Yeah, the guy was Jimmy Lai. Now, here's the thing. Johnson will bring daughter of Jimmy Lai to State of the Union address. Her appearance underscores that America is determined to secure the release of Hong Kong democracy activists. You know what's interesting? Who'd they bring before? Juan Guaido. Right? They bring people who are traitors and puppets to their own countries. To push back, particularly if there's a country with a revolution, and they bring the people to the State of the Union address, and then, there's some kind of a hero. Well, there's certainly not a hero. If the country that's trying to overthrow your government, that openly and actively is trying to overthrow your government, support someone, nah, it's pretty good. It's a pretty good bet that this person is a spy.
Yeah. And then, NED has championed Maria Corina Machado, who advocates for war on their own country and was supporting Trump killing fishermen and ratcheting up sanctions that have cost thousands of lives in Venezuela. And they were touting NED, this guy, Leopoldo Lopez, who was charged with insurrection. After 2014 elections, that the Jimmy Carter, center, said was one of the fairest elections he had ever seen. Lopez, was coordinating terrorists who were burning government buildings and attacking supporters of the government that won, Maduro, and killing them. Like, there were lynchings. And he was charged with sedition. And this is much, much worse than January 6th, which is, conversation for another day.
You're right, yeah.
But
it wasn't full of FBI agents for one thing.
People were up in arms here about the January 6th, but this was 40 times worse, where they're actually killing these insurrectionists are destroying government buildings, killing people, and he was legitimately charged with inciting insurrection. But then NED, and he was the mentor of Juan Guaido, and he comes from like a Spanish nobility or something, and he was the mayor of the wealthiest suburb in Caracas, and I think he was accused of embezzlement. And it's the same like Navalny. They touted Alexei Navalny in Russia, and he had about the support of about 1% or less of the Russian population. And he and his brother were involved in an embezzlement scheme. It's been pretty well documented that they were actually guilty of that. There's a book by Jacques Bau that goes into detail that I read that was convincing to me. And he also embezzled money from a political party, and he was connected to extreme right-wing politics. He referred to immigrants as cockroaches and even supported Nazi ideology. And he was being heralded by the NED as this great, Mandela type figure. So, I mean, the gap between the rhetoric of NED and reality is often great, but unfortunately, they do help shape the narrative. It's part of a Psy-war operation. You see, the CIA had long specialized in propaganda, and they founded the NED as basically a cover for their psychological warfare operations, targeting the American public and also public. They try and reach, build dissident movements in countries that the U.S. targets for regime change. So it is a Psy-war operation, and I think the more people call it out, the better. I don't find a lot of critical reporting about NED on any alternative media, and often they go along with some of their narratives. So that's why, Covert Action, we try and spotlight the NED and the nefarious thing that they do, because it's a very dangerous organization. And as we're discussing, they're appointing some of the worst people imaginable.
Once again, we are talking with, where are we? We're talking with Dr. Jeremy Kuzmarov. He is the editor over at Covert Action magazine. There's lots of great stuff there. I love the series. You got 9/11, Biden, political assassinations. There's one, all kinds of stuff. Yitzhak Rabin assassination. We got Epstein stuff, all kinds of stuff. We've got did the CIA kill? There we go. CIA Inc., the website celebrates the murder of Ukrainian opposition, on and on. Certainly, the government was involved in Malcolm X's assassination, JFK, all this stuff. You go there and just click on series, and you got 9/11, all of these various things that you're going to be interested in, cover-ups, false flags, you name it. Covert Action magazine is the place to go. Thanks a lot, Jeremy. Certainly appreciate you taking time out of your busy schedule on Fridays to hang out with us.
My pleasure. It's always a lot of fun.
All right. Thanks a lot, everybody. Check out Covert Action magazine. Go over there. You can support them. You can enjoy all the stuff that's on there. You will have a great time. Also, thanks to everybody for supporting this channel. Have a great day. Thanks to all my Patreon, Buy Me a Coffee, all of those people who help keep this channel going. Thank you very much. We are out.